The metal detector screamed as Attorney General Jade Monroe stepped through, her professional navy blazer, triggering the alarm for the third time. Warden Ellis Barrow's eyes narrowed with practiced disdain as he watched the black woman fumble with her briefcase. The harsh fluorescent lights cast sharp shadows across his weathered face, highlighting the sneer that had become his trademark when dealing with what he considered undesirable visitors. "Empty your pockets. All of them," he barked, his voice echoing through the sterile visiting room like a drill sergeant addressing fresh recruits. The concrete walls seemed to amplify his authority, bouncing his words back with added menace. "And don't try any of that innocent act with me. I know exactly what criminals like you try to smuggle into my facility." Jade's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly, but she remained silent, her years of courtroom experience teaching her when to hold her fire. She methodically placed her items on the metal tray, a leather wallet, car keys, her phone, and a small notepad. Each item clinked against the stainless steel with the sound of dignity being systematically stripped away. She had expected resistance during this unannounced inspection, but not this level of public humiliation. Around them, other families waiting to visit inmates watched in uncomfortable silence as Barrow's voice grew louder, more aggressive. An elderly Hispanic woman clutched her granddaughter's hand tighter. A young black father shifted nervously, recognizing the tone that meant trouble was brewing. "Before we dive in, this is Chains Broken, where we honor those who refuse to be silenced. If you believe courage deserves to be remembered, subscribe now and carry their legacy forward." Barrow stepped closer, his bulk casting a shadow over the security checkpoint. His uniform strained against his considerable gut, the fabric pulled tight across brass buttons that caught the overhead lighting. 23 years of wielding unchecked authority had given him the confidence of a man who believed his word was law. "You people always think the rules don't apply to you," he continued, his voice dripping with contempt that seemed to seep into the very air of the visiting room. "Coming in here with your fancy clothes, trying to look respectable, but I can smell the street on you from here, lady." Jade's breathing remained controlled, but her mind was racing. She cataloged every word, every gesture, every violation of protocol she was witnessing. The other visitors weren't just uncomfortable, they were terrified. This wasn't aberrant behavior for Barrow. This was his standard operating procedure. Deputy Warden Kai Patel appeared at Barrow's shoulder, clipboard in hand, his expression carefully neutral. He'd learned long ago not to question his superiors' methods, even when they made his stomach turn. The paycheck was too good, and jobs were too scarce to develop a conscience now. "Everything all right here, Warden?" Patel asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer and wasn't particularly interested in changing it. "Just processing another potential contraband smuggler," Barrow replied, his eyes never leaving Jade's face. "Though this one's trying to dress the part of respectability. Probably thinks we're too stupid to see through the costume." Jade finally spoke, her voice steady and professional. "I'm here for an official visit. If you'd like to see my credentials." "Credentials?" Barrow's laugh was harsh and grating, like metal scraping against concrete. "Lady, the only credentials you need in here are honesty, and you're already failing that test." "Official visit? What are you, some kind of public defender? Paralegal maybe? Either way, you're here to see one of our residents, which makes you suspect by association." The irony wasn't lost on Jade. Here she stood, the state's highest law enforcement official, being lectured about honesty by a man whose corruption complaints had landed on her desk 6 months ago. The anonymous letters, the family testimonies, the financial irregularities, it had all led her here, to this moment, experiencing firsthand what dozens of families had tried to tell her about Ellis Barrow. What the warden didn't know was that his routine inspection was being recorded by the very security cameras he thought worked in his favor, and the woman he was degrading held the power to shut down his entire operation with a single phone call. Barrow's eyes gleamed with the particular satisfaction that came from exercising power over someone he perceived as helpless. The visiting room had grown quieter, as if the families waiting understood they were witnessing something that would be remembered long after this Tuesday afternoon faded into memory. "You know what?" Barrow announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I think we need to take this to the next level. Patel, call Henderson. We're doing a full-body search on this one." Corrections Officer Carla Henderson emerged from the administrative office, her keys jangling against her hip like a metallic warning bell. She'd seen this routine before, watched Barrow use the threat of strip searches to humiliate visitors he deemed problematic. Usually they backed down, usually they left in tears and never returned. This woman, Henderson noticed, wasn't moving toward the exit. "A strip search?" Jade asked, her voice carrying the slightest edge that made Henderson pause mid-step. There was something in that tone, something that suggested this wouldn't go as smoothly as Barrow anticipated. "That's right," Barrow confirmed, stepping so close that Jade could smell the coffee and cigarettes on his breath. "Full cavity search, if necessary. You see, when someone sets off our detectors repeatedly and acts suspicious, we have protocols to follow. And you, lady, are checking all the wrong boxes." Henderson glanced around the room nervously. Strip searching visitors without probable cause was illegal, and everyone in the room knew it. But Barrow's authority had gone unchallenged for so long that the distinction between legal and illegal had blurred in his mind. "This is unnecessary and illegal," Jade stated firmly, but her voice remained controlled. "I'm requesting to speak with your supervisor." Barrow's face flushed red with indignation. "I am the supervisor, sweetheart. I run this facility. And if you don't like my methods, you're free to leave and never come back. Matter of fact, I think that's exactly what you should do." The families watching began to shift uncomfortably. The young father with the daughter whispered something to his child, whose eyes had grown wide with fear. The elderly Hispanic woman looked like she wanted to disappear into the institutional green walls. Jade remained perfectly still, her mind working through the legal implications of what was happening. Barrow was creating a textbook case of civil rights violations, building her prosecution's evidence with every word that left his mouth. But she also understood the fear in this room. How many families had been subjected to this treatment? How many had simply walked away rather than endure Barrow's power trip? "I'll ask you one more time," Barrow continued, his voice rising to address the entire room. "Submit to the search, or leave. Those are your options. And let me make something clear to everyone here. This is what happens when people try to bring criminal behavior into my facility." Henderson fidgeted with her radio, clearly uncomfortable with the spectacle, but unwilling to challenge her superior. Deputy Warden Patel had retreated to a corner, suddenly finding paperwork that demanded his immediate attention. The security cameras continued their silent recording, capturing every moment of what would soon become evidence. Jade made a decision that would change everything. Instead of producing her identification, instead of ending Barrow's humiliation with a simple revelation, she chose to let it continue. Because sometimes, justice required experiencing injustice. Sometimes, the only way to truly understand the scope of corruption was to let it play out completely. "I'll submit to your search," she said quietly. "But I want it documented. I want every step of this process recorded and witnessed." Barrow's smile was triumphant and ugly. "Oh, don't worry about that. We document everything here. Henderson, take our visitor to room B for processing. And make sure you're thorough. Real thorough." As Henderson reluctantly gestured toward the hallway, Jade caught the eye of the young father. In that brief moment of contact, she saw recognition, not of who she was, but of what she was enduring for them all. His slight nod told her that her sacrifice wasn't going unnoticed. The concrete walls seemed to close in as they moved toward the search room, but Jade's resolve only strengthened. Every step Barrow took deeper into this violation was another step toward his eventual downfall. And every witness in that visiting room would remember the day the system's true face was finally exposed. The search room was a sterile box of concrete and fluorescent lighting, designed to strip away dignity as efficiently as it stripped away privacy. Officer Henderson closed the door behind them with a soft click that echoed like a cell door slamming shut. The room smelled of disinfectant and fear, a combination that had soaked into the walls over years of humiliation. "Look," Henderson said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry about this. Barrow gets like this sometimes, especially with—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence that hung heavy in the sanitized air. "Especially with people who look like me?" Jade completed, her tone understanding rather than accusatory. Henderson's discomfort was genuine, a stark contrast to Barrow's practiced cruelty. Henderson nodded, shame coloring her cheeks. "I've seen him do this before. He picks someone out, usually someone who can't fight back, and makes an example, says it keeps the others in line." Before Henderson could begin the humiliating process, Barrow's voice boomed through the intercom speaker mounted high on the wall. His words crackled with static and authority, filling the small space like poison gas. "Henderson, make sure you check everything. These people are creative about hiding contraband. Check her hair, her shoes, inside her clothing. And Henderson, take your time. I want our visitor to understand that disrespecting my facility comes with consequences." Jade stood perfectly still, her mind cataloging every violation, every illegal procedure that was about to unfold. But more than that, she was remembering the letters that had arrived at her office over the past 6 months. Letters from families describing exactly this scenario, describing the systematic humiliation that Barrow used as a weapon against Black and Hispanic visitors. One letter had been particularly haunting. A grandmother writing about bringing her 8-year-old grandson to see his father, only to be subjected to accusations and threats of strip searches. The child had nightmares for weeks afterward, too afraid to visit his daddy again. The letter writer had begged for help, for someone in authority to investigate what was happening at Riverside Correctional. That letter, along with dozens of others, had led Jade to this moment. But experiencing it firsthand was different from reading about it. The reality of systematic racism in action was more visceral, more deliberately cruel than words on paper could convey. "You know what your problem is?" Barrow's voice continued through the intercom, as if he were conducting a masterclass in prejudice. "You think because you put on some nice clothes and speak proper English, you can fool people into thinking you're respectable. But I've been in law enforcement for over 2 decades. I can spot a criminal from across the room." Henderson's hands trembled slightly as she approached Jade. "I have to do this," she whispered. "He'll write me up if I don't. I've got kids to feed." "I understand," Jade replied softly. "Do what you have to do. But remember, Officer Henderson, there are laws about how this process is conducted. Laws about reasonable suspicion and probable cause. Laws about dignity and respect." Something in Jade's tone made Henderson pause. The way she spoke about laws wasn't like someone who'd learned about them on the street or from television. It was the voice of someone who lived and breathed legal doctrine. Someone for whom constitutional riddles weren't abstract concepts, but daily realities. "Ma'am," Henderson asked hesitantly, "what did you say your name was again?" Before Jade could answer, Barrow's voice cut through the intercom again, sharper now, impatient. "Henderson, what's taking so long? Strip her down and get on with it. And remember, check everything. These types always have something to hide." The casual dehumanization in Barrow's voice settled over the room like a toxic cloud. These types, not this person or even this visitor. These types, as if Jade's entire identity could be reduced to a racial stereotype. As if her humanity was negotiable based on the color of her skin. Jade closed her eyes briefly, centering herself for what was coming. She thought about all the families who had endured this treatment with no recourse, no voice, no power to fight back. They had submitted to Barrow's humiliation because the alternative was being banned from seeing their loved ones. They had swallowed their dignity because the system offered them no choice. But Jade did have a choice. And she was choosing to experience every moment of this violation, so that she could tear down the system that allowed it to happen. "Officer Henderson," she said calmly, Proceed with your search, but know that everything happening in this room is being documented, and there will be consequences for violations of proper procedure." Henderson's eyes widened slightly at the certainty in Jade's voice. This wasn't the desperate plea of someone trying to avoid humiliation. This was the quiet promise of someone who understood exactly how justice worked. 20 minutes later, Jade emerged from the search room, with her dignity intact, and Henderson's respect earned. The officer had conducted the most professional, least invasive search possible, under Barrow's watchful supervision, but the violation remained. The message had been sent, received, and would be remembered. Barrow waited in the visiting room lobby, his arms crossed over his barrel chest, his expression one of smug satisfaction. The other families had been processed and allowed through to see their loved ones, leaving Jade alone with the warden and his carefully cultivated atmosphere of intimidation. Well, Barrow said, his voice carrying the tone of false surprise that bullies perfected over years of practice. "Look what we found. Henderson says you're clean, but that doesn't mean you're here for legitimate purposes. In fact, I'm starting to think there's something fishy about your whole story." He pulled out a worn clipboard. Its pages yellowed from years of use and occasional coffee stains. The visitor log was a relic from another era, when record-keeping was done by hand and accountability was easier to avoid. "See, I've been looking at your ID again," Barrow continued, holding up Jade's driver's license like a prosecutor presenting evidence. "And something doesn't add up. This address doesn't match our database. Matter of fact, I think this might be a fake ID." Jade remained silent, watching Barrow dig his hole deeper, with every fabricated concern. Her driver's license was perfectly legitimate, issued by the state DMV just 6 months ago when she'd moved into the governor's mansion area for security reasons. But Barrow wasn't interested in legitimacy. He was interested in maintaining his power trip. Deputy Warden Patil reappeared, drawn by the commotion like a moth to flame. His presence gave Barrow an audience, which only encouraged his performance. "Patil, take a look at this," Barrow said, waving the license in the air. "What do you think about someone showing up here with suspicious identification, setting off our metal detectors, and claiming to be here for an official visit? Think we might have a problem?" Patel examined the license with the careful attention of someone who knew his paycheck depended on agreeing with his superior. The ID was flawless, the hologram authentic, the information clearly legitimate, but legitimacy wasn't the point. "Could be a sophisticated fake," Patel offered weakly, his moral compass spinning wildly as he tried to find true north in Barrow's magnetic field of corruption. "Exactly what I was thinking," Barrow agreed, his smile widening. "Which means we have probable cause to deny this visit entirely. Can't have potentially dangerous individuals accessing our facility based on questionable documentation." Jade watched the performance with the detached interest of a scientist observing a particularly virulent strain of bacteria. Barrow's corruption wasn't random or emotional. It was systematic, practiced, refined. Through years of unchecked authority, he had created a system where his word was law, where documentation could be questioned on whim, where constitutional rights were privileges he could grant or revoke based on his personal prejudices. Furthermore, Barrow continued, warming his theme, "I'm not convinced you're here to see an inmate at all. I think you might be some kind of activist, maybe working with one of those prison reform groups, trying to infiltrate my facility to cause trouble." The irony was so perfect that Jade had to suppress a smile. Barrow's paranoia about infiltration was about to become his worst nightmare, realized, but not in the way he imagined. "I can assure you," Jade said carefully, "that I'm here in an official capacity, and my visit is completely legitimate." "Official capacity?" Barrow's laugh was harsh and dismissive. "Lady, the only official capacity you represent is trouble. And trouble isn't welcome in my house." He moved closer, using his bulk to intimidate, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper that had cowed hundreds of visitors before. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, his breath hot against Jade's face. "You're going to take your fake ID, your suspicious story, and your criminal attitude, and you're going to walk out that door, and you're never going to come back." Because if I see you again, if you try to bring your street problems into my clean facility, I'll have you arrested for trespassing and fraud." The threat hung in the air like a toxic cloud. But Jade didn't step back. She didn't flinch. She simply looked into Barrow's eyes with the steady gaze of someone who knew that justice, though sometimes delayed, was never truly denied. "Warden Barrow," she said quietly, "I think you're going to regret this conversation." His face flushed red with indignation. "Are you threatening me?" "No," Jade replied calmly. "I'm promising you." Barrow's face had turned an alarming shade of red, the veins in his neck standing out like rope under tension. Jade's calm promise had struck something deep, something that his years of unchecked authority hadn't prepared him to handle. For the first time in their encounter, she had spoken to him not as a victim, but as an equal. It was a tone that suggested consequences, and Ellis Barrow had spent his entire career avoiding those. "That's it," he snarled, reaching for the radio clip to his belt. "Henderson, Brooks, get down here now. We've got a situation." The radio crackled to life immediately. "On our way, Warden," came Officer Henderson's voice, tight with tension. She had heard the edge in Barrow's tone, the note that meant someone was about to have a very bad day. Within seconds, footsteps echoed through the corridor outside the visiting room. Henderson appeared first, followed by Guard Liam Brooks, whose expression suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. Brooks was young, barely 2 years out of the correctional academy, and he'd already seen enough of Barrow's methods to make his stomach turn. But bills had to be paid, and jobs were scarce. "Sir?" Henderson asked, though her eyes remained fixed on Jade, with something approaching sympathy. "This individual," Barrow said, spitting the word like it tasted bad, "has made threats against a state official, specifically me. I want her escorted off the premises immediately, and I want her banned from this facility permanently." Brooks shifted uncomfortably. "Warden, what kind of threats are we talking about?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Barrow's eyes narrowed as he studied his subordinate. "Are you questioning my assessment, Brooks?" "No, sir," Brooks replied quickly, but his hesitation had already been noted. "I just want to make sure we follow proper procedure." Proper procedure. The word seemed to physically pain Barrow, as if someone had suggested he follow traffic laws while driving a tank. His version of procedure had been refined over 2 decades of doing whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted, to whomever he wanted. "The proper procedure," Barrow said slowly, deliberately, "is whatever I say it is. This is my facility. These are my rules. And my rule is that troublemakers get removed before they can cause problems for law-abiding citizens." Jade watched the dynamic between the officers with the keen eye of someone who had spent years reading courtroom behavior. Henderson was conflicted, her professional training warring with her desire to keep her job. Brooks was young enough to still have ideals but experienced enough to know they wouldn't pay his rent. And Barrow was desperate to maintain control of a situation that was rapidly spiraling away from him. "Officers," Jade said calmly, "before you take any action, I think you should know that this entire encounter has been recorded. Every word, every action, every violation of proper procedure has been documented." Henderson's eyes widened slightly. Brooks looked around the room, noticing for the first time that the security cameras were indeed operational, and pointed directly at their little gathering. "So what?" Barrow snapped. "Those cameras are under my control. I decide what gets recorded and what gets deleted. And this conversation? It never happened." The casual admission of evidence tampering fell from his lips like confession in an empty church. Jade filed it away with all the other admissions that Barrow was providing free of charge. "Furthermore," Barrow continued, his voice rising as his desperation grew, "I'm calling in additional security. This individual has become belligerent and potentially dangerous. Henderson, radio the state police. Tell them we need immediate assistance with a disruptive visitor." Henderson hesitated, her finger hovering over her radio. "Sir, are you sure? Calling state police for a visitor dispute might raise questions." "Questions." Barrow's voice cracked like a whip. The only question is whether my orders get followed or whether I need to find new officers who understand the chain of command. The threat was clear. Comply or face unemployment. It was the same leverage Barrow had used for years to ensure loyalty, the same economic intimidation that had turned decent people into accomplices in his systematic abuse. Brooks cleared his throat nervously. Warden, maybe we should just ask the visitor to leave voluntarily. No need to escalate if she's willing to go peacefully. Peaceful? Barrow laughed. But there was no humor in the sound. Look at her, Brooks. Look at that attitude. That's not peaceful. That's defiant. That's dangerous. That's exactly the kind of troublemaker who comes back with friends, who files complaints, who causes problems for good officers just trying to do their jobs. Jade remained perfectly still throughout the exchange, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to Barrow's growing hysteria. She understood that she was witnessing something rare, a corrupt official losing control in real time, making mistakes that would be impossible to cover up later. Officer Brooks, she said quietly, I want you to remember this moment. Remember what you're seeing, what you're hearing, because someday you're going to be asked about it under oath. The words hit Brooks like a physical blow. Under oath. That meant courts. That meant lawyers. That meant consequences for everyone involved. Not just Barrow. Enough, Barrow roared. I want her out of here now. All of you move. But as the officers reluctantly moved toward Jade, the sound of approaching engines echoed from the parking lot outside. Multiple vehicles, moving fast, tires crunching on gravel with the urgency of an emergency response. Jade smiled for the first time since entering the facility. I think, she said softly, my backup has arrived. The convoy of black SUVs pulled into Riverside Correctional's parking lot with the precision of a military operation. Through the visiting room windows, Barrow could see at least 6 vehicles, their tinted windows reflecting the afternoon sun like dark mirrors. Men and women in professional attire emerged from the cars, their movements coordinated and purposeful. What the hell? Barrow muttered, his bravado beginning to crack around the edges. Henderson, did you call for backup? No, sir, Henderson replied, her own confusion evident. I never made the call to state police. Brooks moved to the window, his young face pale with sudden understanding. Warden, those aren't state police. Those are federal plates. The words hit Barrow like ice water. Federal. The word that every corrupt local official feared most. The jurisdiction that couldn't be bought, bullied, or bureaucratically buried. Jade reached into her blazer pocket, slowly and deliberately, her movements calculated to avoid any appearance of threat. She withdrew a phone, its screen already lit with multiple missed calls and text messages. I should probably take this, she said calmly, pressing the answer button. This is Attorney General Monroe. The words fell into the visiting room like grenades with their pins pulled. Attorney General. The title that carried the authority of the entire state justice system. The office that prosecuted corruption cases. The position that could end careers with a single investigation. Barrow's face went white, then gray, as if all the blood had suddenly decided to relocate to his feet. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish gasping for air in a dried-up pond. Yes, Jade continued into the phone, her voice professionally crisp. I'm still at Riverside Correctional. No, the visit didn't go as planned. In fact, I think we have enough evidence to proceed immediately with a full investigation. Henderson's clipboard clattered to the floor. Brooks took an involuntary step backward. Deputy Warden Patel, who had been silently observing from the corner, made a small choking sound. Impossible, Barrow whispered. But his voice carried no conviction. The evidence was walking through his front door at that very moment, armed with federal authority and witness statements. Through the phone, Jade's security detail could be heard coordinating their approach. Building secured. No additional exits. All personnel to remain in place for questioning. You're not, Barrow started, but the words died in his throat as Jade fixed him with a stare that could have frozen hellfire. I'm not what, Warden? She asked, covering the phone's microphone. Not the Attorney General? Not the person you've been racially profiling and illegally searching for the past hour. Not the official responsible for investigating exactly the kind of systematic abuse you've just demonstrated. The sound of footsteps in the corridor grew louder. Multiple sets of professional shoes moving with purpose, accompanied by the jingle of handcuffs and the rustle of official paperwork. "Sir," Brooks said quietly, his voice barely audible. "I think we're in trouble." Barrow's eyes darted around the room like a cornered animal, looking for escape routes. The windows were barred. The exits were controlled. His kingdom had just become his prison. "This is a misunderstanding," he said desperately, his earlier authority evaporating like morning mist. "I was just following protocol. Standard security procedures. Nothing improper happened here." Jade ended her phone call and slipped the device back into her pocket. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of absolute authority. The kind that came not from intimidation, but from legitimate power backed by justice. "Warden Ellis Barrow," she said formally, "you are under investigation for civil rights violations, abuse of authority, evidence tampering, and conspiracy to deny constitutional protections to citizens based on race. These proceedings are being recorded and will be used in federal prosecution." The visiting room door burst open, and Agent Sarah Chen of the Attorney General's Protection Detail entered, followed by 3 additional agents. Their arrival transformed the space from Barrow's domain into a crime scene. "Ma'am," Agent Chen said, relief evident in her voice. "Are you injured?" "No," Jade replied. "But I am profoundly disappointed in what I've witnessed here today. Agent Chen, I want every employee in this facility interviewed. I want every security recording from the past 6 months reviewed, and I want a complete audit of visitor treatment policies and their implementation." Barrow slumped against the wall, the weight of his situation finally settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. 23 years of unchecked authority, of systematic racism, of believing himself untouchable, had just come crashing down in the span of 5 minutes. "Officers Henderson and Brooks," Jade continued, "you will be questioned as witnesses. Your cooperation in this investigation will be noted in your personnel files." Henderson nodded quickly, relief and terror warring on her face. Brooks simply stared at the floor, probably calculating how many laws he'd watched get broken without intervention. "And Warden Barrow," Jade said, her voice carrying the finality of a judge's gavel, "your career in corrections is officially over." The visiting room had transformed into something resembling a crime scene, with federal agents systematically documenting every corner where Jade's humiliation had unfolded. Agent Chen coordinated with her team, while Jade provided a detailed account of the past hour's events, her voice steady and professional despite the gravity of what she was describing. Barrow sat slumped in a plastic chair, his uniform wrinkled and his face the color of old concrete. The man who had strutted through his domain an hour earlier now looked like he was attending his own funeral. Deputy Warden Patel stood frozen against the wall, his clipboard forgotten in his hands, while officers Henderson and Brooks waited nervously for their turns to be questioned. "Agent Chen," Jade said quietly, "I want to speak with the families who witnessed this encounter. They need to understand that what they saw was not normal procedure, and they have rights that were violated today." Through the windows, more vehicles were arriving. News vans with satellite dishes extended like mechanical flowers, reaching toward the sky. Word was spreading fast that something significant was happening at Riverside Correctional, and in the age of social media, significant news traveled at the speed of light. Henderson approached Agent Chen with hesitant steps, her face pale with the realization that her career hung in the balance. "Ma'am, I want to cooperate fully with the investigation. I have information about previous incidents, things I documented but was told to keep quiet about." The admission sent a visible shudder through Barrow, who seemed to shrink further into his chair. His empire of intimidation was crumbling as subordinates realized that loyalty to corruption was a luxury they could no longer afford. "Officer Henderson," Agent Chen replied, "your cooperation will be noted. We'll be conducting formal interviews with all staff members, and any documentation you can provide will be valuable evidence." Brooks stepped forward as well, his young face flushed with shame and determination. "I have recordings," he said quietly. "On my personal phone, conversations I recorded, because I was afraid of being blamed for things I didn't do." Barrows made statements, racist statements about visitors. "I kept them as protection." The confession hit the room like a thunderbolt. Even the federal agents paused their documentation to process the implications. If Brooks had recordings of Barrow's racist comments, the case would move from civil rights violations to hate crime territory. Jade watched the systematic collapse of Barrow's operation with the satisfaction of someone who had endured injustice specifically to ensure justice would be complete. Every witness coming forward, every piece of evidence being revealed, every admission of wrongdoing was validation of her strategic patience. Outside, the media presence was growing. Local news crews were setting up equipment, their cameras pointed at the facility's entrance, like artillery aimed at a fortress. The story was bigger than one corrupt warden. It was about systematic racism in the state's correctional system, and that made it front-page material. Barrow finally found his voice, though it came out cracked and desperate. "This is all a misunderstanding. I was following established protocols. Every prison has security procedures." Warden Barrow, Agent Chen, interrupted, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to dealing with desperate criminals. "You have the right to remain silent. I strongly suggest you exercise that right until you can speak with an attorney." The Miranda warning, delivered in the visiting room where Barrow had wielded absolute power just hours before, carried the weight of cosmic irony. The man who had threatened to have Jade arrested was now facing arrest himself. "Ma'am," Henderson said to Jade, her voice trembling with emotion, "I want to apologize. What happened to you today was wrong, and I should have stopped it. I've watched him do this to other families, and I said nothing. I was afraid for my job, but that's no excuse." Jade studied the young officer with compassion rather than judgment. Henderson was a victim of the same system that had created Barrow, trapped between survival and conscience in a workplace that rewarded compliance and punished integrity. "Officer Henderson," Jade replied gently, "your courage to speak up now matters more than your silence before. Help us ensure this never happens to another family." The sound of car doors slamming echoed from the parking lot as more officials arrived. State corrections administrators, legislative representatives, and senior law enforcement officials were converging on Riverside Correctional, like antibodies responding to an infection. Through it all, Jade maintained her professional composure, but inside, she felt the deep satisfaction of a trap perfectly executed. Every moment of humiliation she had endured, every racist comment she had absorbed, every illegal procedure she had documented, had been worth it to gather the evidence needed to dismantle this system of abuse. "Agent Chen," she said quietly, "make sure we have statements from every family that was present during this incident. Their testimony will be crucial for establishing the pattern of intimidation and racial profiling." As if summoned by her words, the elderly Hispanic woman, who had clutched her granddaughter's hand during Jade's humiliation, appeared in the doorway, escorted by another federal agent. Her eyes were bright with tears, but her voice was strong with purpose. "I want to tell you what I've seen," she said in accented but clear English. "What this man has done to my family, to other families. For years we've been afraid to speak. Today I saw courage, and it gave me courage too." The dominoes were falling, each witness statement adding weight to the case against Barrow and momentum to the broader investigation. What had started as one woman's encounter with systematic racism was becoming a reckoning with institutional corruption. The moment had arrived for official documentation of Jade's identity, and Agent Chen approached with the federal ID scanner that would formally record the incident. The device, standard equipment for Attorney General security details, would create an official record that could never be disputed or deleted. "Ma'am," Agent Chen said, "for the federal incident report, I need to scan your official identification." Jade reached into her blazer and withdrew her credentials, a black leather wallet containing her official state Attorney General identification card, complete with federal clearance codes and security hologram. The ID that had been in her possession all along, The one that could have ended Barrow's humiliation with a single glance. The one she had chosen not to reveal in order to experience the full scope of his corruption. The scanner beeped softly as it processed the information, and within seconds, Jade's official status appeared on the agent's tablet screen. Monroe Jade L., Attorney General, State of State Name, Federal Security Clearance, Level 7, Status Active. Barrow's eyes fixed on the screen from across the room, his face cycling through disbelief, horror, and resignation. The full weight of his mistake was settling on him like a collapsed building. He hadn't just abused a visitor, he had committed federal crimes against the state's highest law enforcement official. Jesus Christ, he whispered, the words escaping like air from a punctured tire. Deputy Warden Patel made a sound that might have been a whimper. Officer Brooks stared at his shoes as if they contained the secrets of the universe. Officer Henderson closed her eyes and took a deep breath, probably calculating how many policies and procedures she had watched get violated. For the record, Agent Chen announced to the room, her voice carrying the finality of a court judgment. This incident involved the systematic harassment, illegal detention, and attempted sexual assault of Attorney General Jade Monroe by Warden Ellis Barrow and staff of Riverside Correctional Facility. The words, attempted sexual assault, hit the room like a physical blow. The strip search demands, the invasive procedures, the deliberate humiliation, all of it now carried the weight of federal crimes against a constitutional officer. Jade's phone buzzed with an incoming call, and she glanced at the screen before answering. Governor Williams, she said formally, putting the call on speaker so the room could hear the conversation. Jade, I just received word about the situation at Riverside. Are you safe? The governor's voice carried the urgency of someone dealing with a political crisis that was expanding by the minute. I'm safe, Governor. But I'm afraid we have a significant problem with our correctional system that requires immediate action. Whatever you need. Full resources. I'm declaring an emergency investigation into all state correctional facilities. This ends today. The promise of statewide investigation sent another visible shudder through Barrow. His corruption wasn't isolated to Riverside. It was part of a larger pattern that would now face scrutiny from the highest levels of state government. Furthermore, the governor continued, his voice hardening, I want criminal charges filed against everyone involved in this incident. Federal charges. This wasn't just harassment. This was an attack on the rule of law itself. Jade looked directly at Barrow as she responded, I agree completely, Governor. This facility will be shut down for investigation, and every employee will be questioned under oath. We're going to find out how deep this corruption goes. Barrow's shoulders sagged, as if he were physically carrying the weight of his collapsed career. 23 years of unchecked authority, of systematic racism, of believing himself untouchable, had just resulted in federal charges and a statewide investigation. Warden Barrow, Jade said, approaching his chair with the measured steps of someone delivering a final judgment. You asked me earlier what my credentials were. Now you know. I am the Attorney General of this state. I am the person responsible for prosecuting civil rights violations. I am the official who received dozens of complaints about your treatment of families. Complaints I decided to investigate personally. She paused, letting the full implications settle over him like a burial shroud. And I am the prosecutor who will ensure you face the full consequences of your actions. The room fell silent, except for the sound of Barrow's labored breathing and the distant noise of media crews setting up outside. Justice, though sometimes delayed, was never truly denied. And today, in a visiting room designed to strip away dignity, dignity had won. Agent Chen stepped forward with handcuffs gleaming silver in the fluorescent light. Ellis Barrow, you are under arrest for civil rights violations, conspiracy, abuse of office, and assault on a federal official. You have the right to remain silent. As the Miranda rights echoed through the visiting room, where Barrow had once ruled with impunity, Jade felt the deep satisfaction of a system working as it was designed to work. Slowly, imperfectly, but inevitably toward justice. The handcuffs clicked shut around Barrow's wrists with the finality of a coffin lid closing. The sound echoed through the visiting room, marking the end of an era of unchecked corruption and the beginning of a reckoning that would reach far beyond Riverside Correctional's concrete walls. Agent Chen's team moved with practiced efficiency, processing the arrest while maintaining the dignity that Barrow had spent years denying to others. Even in his moment of downfall, he was treated with the constitutional protections he had systematically violated. "Transport is ready," Agent Rodriguez announced through his radio. "Suspect will be transferred to federal holding for initial processing." Jade watched the proceedings with the analytical eye of someone who had prosecuted hundreds of similar cases. But this one carried personal weight. She had felt the sting of systematic racism, experienced the helplessness that countless families had endured, and now she was witnessing justice begin its slow but inexorable process. "Ma'am," Agent Chen approached with a tablet displaying preliminary witness statements. "We have 3 families who were present during the incident, willing to provide testimony. The elderly woman, Miss Rosa Santos, has particularly detailed observations about previous incidents involving her family." Mrs. Santos stepped forward, her granddaughter still holding tightly to her hand. The little girl's eyes were wide with the understanding that something important was happening, even if she couldn't grasp the full implications. "Attorney General," Mrs. Santos began, her voice gaining strength with each word. "For 3 years my family has been coming here to see my son. 3 years of being treated like criminals because of the color of our skin. This man," she gestured toward Barrow as he was led away, "has made my granddaughter afraid of police uniforms." The impact of her words hit the room like a physical force. Jade knelt down to the little girl's level, her voice gentle but clear. "Sweetheart, what happened here today was wrong. The police and prison guards are supposed to protect people, not frighten them. We're going to make sure this never happens to you or your family again." The child nodded solemnly, her trust in authority figures already damaged by Barrow's systematic abuse. Repairing that damage would take time, patience, and fundamental changes to how the system operated. Officer Brooks approached Agent Chen with his phone in hand, his face pale but determined. "Agent, I have approximately 47 audio recordings spanning the last 8 months. Conversations with Barrow where he made explicitly racist statements about visitors, discussions of targeting specific families, and plans to intimidate people into not visiting their relatives." The significance of Brooks's evidence hit everyone in the room simultaneously. 47 recordings meant this wasn't isolated incidents or heat-of-the-moment bias. This was systematic, planned, coordinated racism executed as official policy. "Officer Brooks," Jade said, "your decision to document these conversations may have saved this investigation. Why did you start recording?" Brooks swallowed hard before answering. "Because I knew it was wrong, and I was afraid I'd be blamed if something happened. I joined corrections to help people, not to watch them get abused. But I needed proof that I wasn't participating willingly." Henderson nodded in agreement. "Ma'am, I kept written logs too. Dates, times, specific statements. I was building a case to report to state authorities, but I didn't know who to trust. The whole system seemed compromised." The admission revealed the depth of the corruption. It wasn't just Barrow. It was a culture that had infected the entire facility, creating an environment where good officers felt they had no recourse but silent documentation of abuse. Agent Chen's radio crackled with updates from the teams now spreading through the facility. "Control. We've secured the administrative offices. Preliminary search reveals multiple filing cabinets with visitor complaint forms that were never processed. Estimate several hundred documents requiring review." The scale of the cover-up was becoming clear. Hundreds of complaints, systematically buried, representing hundreds of families who had been abused and silenced. Each unprocessed form represented a failure of the system to protect those it was supposed to serve. Furthermore, the radio continued, "We found evidence of financial irregularities, commissary contracts, phone system charges, and visitor processing fees that appear to have been inflated. Request financial crime specialist for comprehensive audit. Jade's expression hardened as the full scope of Barrow's corruption came into focus. This wasn't just about racial harassment. It was about systematic exploitation of the families of incarcerated individuals, people who had no choice but to endure abuse if they wanted to maintain contact with their loved ones. Deputy Warden Patel, who had remained silent throughout the arrest proceedings, finally stepped forward with visible reluctance. Attorney General, I want to cooperate with the investigation. I have information about the administrative structure that allowed this to happen. His offer of cooperation carried the desperate tone of someone trying to save his career. But Jade recognized that Patel's information could be crucial for understanding how such systematic abuse had been institutionalized. Mr. Patel, she replied formally, your cooperation will be noted, but understand that this investigation will examine everyone's role in maintaining this system of abuse. Intent and complicity will be determined by evidence, not claims. As Barrow was led through the facility in handcuffs, passing the cells of inmates he had ruled with impunity, word spread quickly through the prison grapevine. Prisoners pressed against their cell doors, watching their tormentors perp walk with a mixture of disbelief and satisfaction. Is it really over? Mrs. Santos asked quietly, her voice carrying the hope of someone who had endured too much disappointment to trust easily. Jade looked at the woman who represented hundreds of families who had suffered in silence. Mrs. Santos, this is just the beginning. We're going to investigate every facility in the state. We're going to change the laws. And we're going to make sure no family ever faces what you've endured. The media circus outside Riverside Correctional had grown from a few local news vans to a full-scale press conference setup. Satellite trucks lined the parking lot like mechanical vultures, their dishes pointed skyward to broadcast the story across the nation. The arrest of a prison warden for racially motivated abuse of the state's Attorney General was the kind of story that captured public attention and refused to let go. Inside the facility, federal agents worked systematically through 2 decades of records, uncovering layer upon layer of systematic corruption. The evidence room had been transformed into a command center, with boxes of documents stacked like building blocks of a case that was growing stronger by the hour. Special Agent Maria Gonzalez, the FBI's senior civil rights investigator, had arrived to take charge of the federal aspects of the case. Her reputation for thorough, relentless prosecution of institutional racism made her the perfect choice to ensure that justice would be comprehensive rather than cosmetic. Attorney General Monroe, Agent Gonzalez said, approaching with a preliminary report, what we're uncovering here goes beyond individual misconduct. This appears to be systematic civil rights violations spanning multiple years, with evidence of cover-ups reaching into the State Corrections Administration. The implications were staggering. If the corruption reached beyond Riverside into the state corrections system, it meant potentially thousands of families had been subjected to similar abuse across multiple facilities. Jade studied the preliminary findings with the focus of someone whose entire career had been built on dismantling systematic injustice. Agent Gonzalez, I want every state correctional facility investigated, full audit of policies, procedures, and implementation. If this cancer has spread, we're going to cut it out completely. Officer Liam Brooks sat across from investigators, his recorded evidence spread across the table like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that revealed the ugly picture of institutional racism. Each audio file contained damning statements that would be impossible for Barrow's defense team to explain away. In this recording from March, Brooks explained, pointing to a transcript, Barrow specifically states that he targets Black and Hispanic families for additional security measures because, quote, those people are naturally more likely to cause problems. The statement was textbook racial profiling, the kind of explicit bias that federal civil rights laws were designed to prohibit. But what made it worse was the casual nature of Barrow's racism, as if such thoughts were so normal, they didn't require justification. And here, Brooks continued, he discusses modifying visitor logs to create justification for denying visits. He calls it administrative discipline, but it's really just harassment designed to discourage families from visiting. Agent Gonzalez shook her head in disgust. 23 years of this. How many families gave up? How many children lost contact with their parents because of this systematic abuse? The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had burned for too long. The damage wasn't just legal. It was human, generational, immeasurable in its scope and impact. Meanwhile, in the facility's administrative wing, forensic accountants were discovering a web of financial corruption that complemented the civil rights violations, inflated commissary prices, excessive phone charges, and mysterious processing fees that had no legitimate basis in correctional policy. The financial exploitation is systematic, reported Agent Thomas Wright, the federal financial crime specialist. Families were being charged illegal fees for basic services, with the revenue going into discretionary accounts that Barrow controlled without oversight. The financial abuse added another layer to the systematic targeting of families. Not only were they humiliated and harassed, but they were financially exploited, forced to pay inflated costs for the privilege of maintaining contact with their incarcerated relatives. Sophia Moreno, the family advocate who had been fighting for visitors' rights for years, arrived at the facility with documentation of complaints that had been ignored by state officials. Her files contained testimonies from dozens of families describing experiences identical to what Jade had endured. "Attorney General," Sophia said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had fought these battles in courtrooms and legislative hearings. "I've been trying to get someone to listen to these families for 3 years. Thank you for finally experiencing what they've been trying to tell us." Her words carried both gratitude and reproach. The system had failed these families until one of them happened to be the person responsible for prosecuting systematic abuse. It was a reminder that justice often required privilege to access, and that fundamental reform was needed to ensure equal protection under law. As the investigation expanded, more staff members came forward with evidence of Barrow's corruption. Guards, administrators, and even medical staff had witnessed systematic abuse, but had been afraid to report it due to Barrow's control over their employment. "He created a culture of fear," explained Dr. Jennifer Hayes, the facility's medical director. Staff knew that questioning his methods meant losing their jobs. In a rural area with limited employment opportunities, that was economic terrorism. The phrase economic terrorism captured the essence of how systematic corruption maintained itself. By controlling people's livelihoods, corrupt officials could ensure silence and complicity, even from those who recognized the wrongdoing. By evening, the scope of the investigation had expanded to include federal charges against Barrow, administrative reviews of all state correctional facilities, and a comprehensive audit of visitor rights policies. The case that had started with one woman's encounter with racism had become a catalyst for systematic reform. But for Jade, standing in the parking lot as news crews prepared their evening broadcasts, the most important outcome wasn't the career she had ended or the system she would reform. It was the little girl holding her grandmother's hand, no longer afraid of police uniforms, because she had seen justice work the way it was supposed to work. That was worth every moment of humiliation she had endured. The administrative wing of Riverside Correctional had been transformed into a federal crime scene, with evidence technicians cataloging decades of systematic abuse. Box after box of documents emerged from filing cabinets that had been deliberately misfiled, hidden or marked as routine administrative materials to avoid scrutiny. Agent Chen supervised the evidence collection with meticulous attention to detail. Each document was photographed, cataloged, and cross-referenced to build a comprehensive picture of how Barrow's corruption had operated. The sheer volume of evidence suggested a level of systematic abuse that even seasoned federal investigators found shocking. "Ma'am," Agent Rodriguez called from across the room, "we've found the surveillance footage archives. Looks like Barrow kept backup copies of security recordings in a personal safe, probably as insurance against his own staff." The irony was perfect. Barrow's paranoia about staff betrayal had led him to create the very evidence that would destroy him. Hours of footage showing illegal searches, racist harassment, and systematic targeting of minority families, all carefully preserved by the man who had committed the crimes. Jade approached the monitor where technicians were reviewing the recovered footage. The first video showed a scene disturbingly similar to her own experience. A young black mother being subjected to invasive searches while her toddler cried in the waiting area. The timestamp indicated the incident had occurred just 3 weeks earlier. "How many videos are there?" Jade asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "Preliminary count suggests over 200 hours of footage spanning 5 years. Agent Rodriguez replied. "And that's just what we've found so far. If Barrow kept this much evidence of his own crimes, there's no telling what else we might discover." Sophia Marino had established a victim assistance station in the facility's conference room, where families were coming forward to share their experiences. The stories were remarkably consistent. Systematic harassment, racist comments, illegal searches, and financial exploitation that had continued unchecked for years. "The pattern is always the same," Sophia explained to Jade as they reviewed witness statements. "Initial harassment to test compliance, escalation if the family shows any resistance, and then ongoing targeting that makes visiting their relative a traumatic experience." One testimony stood out among the others. Maria Vasquez, a nurse whose teenage son had been incarcerated for a nonviolent drug offense, described being strip-searched in front of other visitors because Barrow claimed her scrubs made her look suspicious. "He said people like me were probably smuggling drugs because we had medical knowledge." Maria's statement read, "He made me remove my scrubs down to my underwear in a room with windows where other families could see. My son stopped accepting visits because he was ashamed of what I had to endure." The psychological impact of Barrow's abuse extended beyond the immediate victims to affect family relationships and the rehabilitation process itself. Inmates were losing contact with support systems because their families couldn't endure the systematic humiliation required to maintain visitation. Dr. Hayes, the facility's medical director, provided testimony that revealed the health consequences of Barrow's policies. "We've seen increased rates of depression, anxiety, and self-harm among inmates whose families stopped visiting. The correlation with Barrow's targeting of specific families is statistically significant." The medical evidence added another dimension to the case. Barrow's racism wasn't just violating civil rights. It was actively harming the mental health of incarcerated individuals and undermining the correctional system's stated goal of rehabilitation. Agent Gonzalez coordinated with state prosecutors to ensure that both federal and state charges would be comprehensive. The evidence was overwhelming. But the goal wasn't just to convict Barrow. It was to dismantle the entire system that had allowed such abuse to flourish. "We're looking at RICO charges," Agent Gonzalez explained to Jade. "This wasn't individual misconduct. This was organized criminal activity conducted under color of law. Barrow, his supervisors who ignored complaints, and the contractors who benefited from inflated fees could all face federal racketeering charges." The escalation to RICO prosecution sent shockwaves through the state correction system. Officials who had ignored complaints or facilitated Barrow's abuse were now facing potential federal charges that could result in decades in prison. Meanwhile, forensic accountants had uncovered the financial structure that had funded Barrow's operation. Inflated commissary contracts, excessive phone charges, and illegal processing fees had generated nearly $2 million in unauthorized revenue over 5 years. "The money wasn't just stolen," explained Agent Wright. "It was used to fund the harassment operation." Barrow paid bonuses to guards who participated in targeting minority families, creating a financial incentive for systematic racism. The revelation that racism had been financially incentivized added a particularly disturbing element to the case. Officers weren't just following orders, they were being paid extra to violate civil rights, turning constitutional violations into a profit center. As evidence continued to accumulate, the media attention intensified. National news networks picked up the story, framing it as an example of systematic racism in the criminal justice system. Civil rights organizations announced plans for comprehensive lawsuits, and legislative hearings were scheduled to examine how such abuse had been allowed to continue. But in the evidence room, surrounded by boxes of documents that represented years of human suffering, Jade focused on the individual stories behind the statistics. Each complaint form, each witness statement, each piece of video evidence represented a family that had been failed by the system they had trusted to protect them. The magnitude of Barrow's crimes was becoming clear, but so was the magnitude of the system's failure to protect its most vulnerable citizens. Officer Liam Brooks sat across from federal investigators in the facility's conference room, his hands trembling slightly as he prepared to detail years of systematic abuse he had witnessed and documented. His decision to come forward represented more than cooperation with an investigation. It was a complete rejection of the culture of corruption that had defined his workplace. "I want to start with my first day," Brooks began, his voice steady despite the weight of what he was about to reveal. Barrow pulled me aside and explained what he called the reality of corrections. He said that maintaining order required making examples of troublemakers, and that family visitors were the easiest way to control inmate behavior. Agent Gonzalez leaned forward, her recorder capturing every word. Brooks's testimony would be crucial for establishing that Barrow's abuse wasn't impulsive racism, but calculated policy designed to maintain control through systematic intimidation. "He specifically told me to watch for certain types of visitors," Brooks continued, making air quotes around Barrow's euphemism. "When I asked what he meant, he laughed and said I'd figure it out quickly enough." Within a week, it became clear he was talking about Black and Hispanic families. The admission provided direct evidence of racial profiling as official, though unwritten policy. Brooks's testimony would show that new officers were deliberately trained to target minority families, making the discrimination systematic rather than incidental. The training was informal but consistent, Brooks explained. Older guards would point out families to watch, share techniques for creating justifications for searches, and teach new officers how to write reports that would protect the facility from complaints. Agent Chen took notes as Brooks described the institutional framework that had protected Barrow's operation. The corruption wasn't just individual. It was embedded in the facility's culture, passed down through unofficial training that taught guards to violate civil rights as standard procedure. "Officer Brooks," Jade interjected, "you mentioned recording conversations. What motivated you to document these interactions?" Brooks's face flushed with shame and determination. "Because I knew it was wrong, but I also knew that speaking up without evidence would just result in my termination." Barrow made it clear that loyalty was rewarded and disloyalty was punished. "I needed protection." His honesty about self-preservation added credibility to his testimony. Brooks wasn't presenting himself as a hero. He was acknowledging the difficult position that institutional corruption created for individual employees who recognized wrongdoing but lacked the power to stop it. "The recording started accidentally," Brooks explained. "I was documenting unusual incidents for my own protection when I realized that Barrow's comments during these conversations were explicitly racist. Once I understood the legal implications, I started recording deliberately." The accidental nature of his initial documentation made the recordings even more valuable as evidence. Defense attorneys would have difficulty arguing that Brooks had deliberately entrapped Barrow when the recordings began as routine self-protection. Agent Gonzalez queued up one of Brooks's audio files on the conference room's sound system. Barrow's voice filled the room, crude and unmistakably racist as he described his approach to visitor management. "You gotta break these people early," Barrow's recorded voice explained. "Let them know who's in charge. The Blacks especially. They come in here with attitude, thinking they got rights. Strip search a few of them in front of their kids, and word spreads. Problem solved." The casual nature of Barrow's racism was as damaging as its content. This wasn't heat-of-the-moment bias. It was calculated strategy, delivered with the confidence of someone who believed his methods were not only acceptable, but effective. "This recording is from my second week on the job," Brooks explained. "Barrow was essentially training me in systematic civil rights violations. presenting racism as correctional policy. Agent Gonzalez paused the recording and studied Brooks with the analytical gaze of someone who had spent years evaluating witness credibility. His nervousness was genuine, his shame apparent, his commitment to truth evident in his willingness to risk his career for justice. "Officer Brooks, are you aware that your testimony and evidence will likely result in criminal charges against colleagues who participated in these activities?" Brooks nodded solemnly. "Yes, ma'am, but those colleagues chose to participate. The families we abused didn't choose to be victims. If my testimony helps them get justice, it's worth whatever consequences I face." His commitment to accountability, even at personal cost, strengthened his credibility and demonstrated the moral courage that institutional corruption typically suppressed. Brooks represented the possibility of redemption within a corrupted system. "There's more," Brooks continued, pulling out a notebook filled with handwritten observations. "I documented financial irregularities too. Guards getting cash bonuses for targeting specific families, commissary contractors paying kickbacks to administrators, and visitor processing fees that went into discretionary accounts with no oversight." The financial corruption evidence complemented the civil rights violations, showing that Barrow's operation was comprehensive criminal enterprise rather than isolated misconduct. The money trail would make prosecution easier and sentences longer. "The worst part," Brooks concluded, his voice breaking slightly, "was watching families stop coming. Kids who stopped visiting their parents, grandparents who gave up trying to see their grandchildren, spouses who couldn't endure the humiliation anymore. We destroyed families, and everyone pretended it was normal." His emotional response to the human cost of systematic abuse provided the moral weight that would make his testimony compelling to juries. Brooks wasn't just providing evidence, he was bearing witness to institutional evil that had been normalized through repetition and unchallenged authority. Agent Gonzalez closed her notebook with the satisfaction of someone who had just received the key to dismantling a criminal conspiracy. Brooks's testimony, combined with his recordings and documentation, provided the foundation for comprehensive prosecution of everyone involved in Barrow's operation. "Officer Brooks," Jade said, as the interview concluded, "your courage in coming forward will help ensure that no other families endure what these victims experienced. That takes real moral courage." Brooks nodded, but his expression remained serious. "Ma'am, I just hope it's enough to fix the system that allowed this to happen. Arresting Barrow is important, but changing the culture that created him is essential." His words captured the challenge ahead. Individual prosecution was necessary, but insufficient. Real justice would require systematic reform of institutional cultures that had normalized racism and abuse of power. The story broke on national news at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, just as families across America were sitting down to dinner. The headline scrolled across screens with the stark simplicity that defined watershed moments. "State Attorney General abused by racist prison warden." Within minutes, social media exploded with reactions that ranged from outrage to disbelief to demands for systematic reform. The hashtag #RiversideRacism began trending as news outlets competed to provide the most comprehensive coverage of what was quickly being called the most significant civil rights case of the decade. At CNN's Atlanta bureau, correspondent Jessica Williams prepared for a live broadcast from outside Riverside Correctional. Behind her, federal agents continued loading evidence boxes into trucks, while families of former visitors gathered to share their own stories with reporters eager for additional perspectives. "This is a story that goes far beyond one corrupt official," Williams explained to her national audience. "According to federal investigators, what happened here represents systematic civil rights violations that may have affected hundreds of families over multiple years." The network had obtained portions of Brooks's audio recordings, and the sound of Barrow's racist comments played over footage of the facility where his abuse had flourished unchecked. The combination of audio evidence and visual context created a powerful narrative that captured public attention and refused to let go. Mrs. Santos stood before a cluster of microphones, her granddaughter beside her, no longer afraid, but proud to watch her grandmother demand justice. For 3 years we suffered in silence because we thought no one would believe us, she said, her voice carrying across the parking lot. Today we learned that silence is not protection. Speaking truth is protection. Her words became a rallying cry for other families who had endured similar abuse at correctional facilities across the state. Phone calls flooded into news stations, civil rights organizations, and the Attorney General's office as victims realized they were not alone and their experiences were part of a larger pattern. The story's impact extended beyond regional news cycles. National civil rights leaders announced plans to travel to the state for a comprehensive investigation of correctional practices. Legal organizations prepared class action lawsuits representing affected families, and political leaders scrambled to address questions about oversight failures that had allowed such systematic abuse to continue. Governor Williams called an emergency press conference from the state capitol, flanked by corrections officials whose faces reflected the gravity of the crisis they were facing. What happened at Riverside Correctional is unacceptable, illegal, and representative of systematic failures that we will address immediately, he announced. The governor's promise of immediate action included several concrete measures: suspension of all senior staff at Riverside pending investigation, implementation of federal oversight at all state correctional facilities, and establishment of an independent commission to review visitor rights policies statewide. But for families watching the coverage, the most important moment came when the governor made a direct apology to every family that suffered abuse while trying to maintain contact with their incarcerated relatives. I apologize on behalf of the state. We failed to protect you, and we will spend however long it takes to earn back your trust. The apology, while politically necessary, couldn't erase years of trauma or repair broken family relationships. But it represented acknowledgement that the abuse was real, systematic, and unacceptable, validation that many families had never expected to receive. At Riverside Correctional, the media attention had transformed the facility from a place of hidden abuse to a symbol of institutional racism. Under public scrutiny, news trucks lined the access road like mechanical sentries, their satellite dishes pointed skyward to broadcast the story of systematic injustice, finally brought into the light. Inside the facility, remaining staff members watched the coverage with a mixture of fear and relief. Those who had participated in Barrow's abuse faced potential prosecution, but those who had been silenced by his intimidation felt validation that their moral concerns had been justified. "I'm scared about what comes next," Officer Henderson confided to a colleague, as they watched federal agents continue their evidence collection. "But I'm also relieved that families will finally get justice." The sentiment was shared by many staff members who had been trapped between their need for employment and their recognition that Barrow's methods were wrong. The investigation offered them an opportunity to break free from a culture of corruption that had defined their workplace for too long. By evening, the story had reached international news outlets, framed as an example of systematic racism in American criminal justice institutions. The global attention added pressure for comprehensive reform and ensured that any attempt to minimize or cover up the scandal would face immediate scrutiny. But the most powerful moment of the day's coverage came when Jade herself appeared at a press conference, flanked by Agent Gonzalez and Sofia Moreno. Her decision to speak publicly about her experience transformed a legal case into a human story that resonated across racial and economic lines. "What happened to me today was wrong," Jade said, her voice carrying the authority of her office and the emotion of personal experience. "But what happened to hundreds of other families over the past several years was equally wrong, and they didn't have the privilege of my position to fight back immediately." Her acknowledgement of privilege added moral weight to her demands for justice. This wasn't about revenge for personal humiliation. It was about using her authority to protect those who lacked such protection. "Today's investigation is just the beginning," Jade continued. "We will examine every state correctional facility. We will review every visitor rights policy. And we will ensure that no family ever again faces the choice between maintaining contact with their loved ones and preserving their dignity." The promise of comprehensive reform delivered with the full authority of the state's chief law enforcement officer, provided hope that systematic change was possible rather than merely promised. The federal investigation had expanded beyond Riverside Correctional to examine what was becoming clear as a statewide pattern of systematic abuse. Agent Gonzalez coordinated with field offices across the state as reports poured in from families who had endured similar treatment at other facilities. By morning, the scope of the investigation had grown to include 7 state correctional facilities, where preliminary evidence suggested systematic targeting of minority families. The pattern was remarkably consistent: racist harassment, illegal searches, financial exploitation, and administrative cover-ups that had protected abusive officials for years. What we're seeing is systematic civil rights violations conducted under color of law across multiple facilities, Agent Gonzalez explained during a briefing with state officials. This wasn't isolated to Riverside or limited to Warden Barrow. This appears to be embedded in the culture of the state correction system. The expansion of the investigation sent shockwaves through the corrections administration. Officials who had ignored complaints or facilitated abuse at other facilities now faced potential federal prosecution under civil rights statutes that carried severe penalties. At the state capitol, legislative hearings were hastily scheduled to examine oversight failures that had allowed such systematic abuse to flourish. Lawmakers who had previously ignored complaints from civil rights organizations now faced intense pressure to explain why their oversight had been so inadequate. How many complaints were filed? How many were investigated? How many resulted in disciplinary action? Senator Patricia Williams demanded during an emergency hearing, "We need answers about how this systematic abuse was allowed to continue for years without intervention." The questions revealed the scope of institutional failure beyond individual misconduct. Systematic abuse required systematic enabling, and that enabling had occurred at multiple levels of government oversight. Sofia Moreno testified before the Legislative Committee with documentation spanning 5 years of ignored complaints. Her files contained hundreds of testimonies from families describing experiences identical to Jade's encounter at Riverside. These families tried to use the system, Sofia explained, holding up thick folders of complaint forms. They filed reports. They contacted legislators. They reached out to media, but they were ignored because they lacked the political power to demand attention. Her testimony highlighted the role that privilege played in access to justice. Jade's experience had received immediate attention because of her position, but identical abuse of powerless families had been systematically ignored. The financial investigation revealed that the corruption extended beyond individual facilities to include statewide contracts that had inflated costs for basic services. Commissary suppliers, phone companies, and transportation services had all paid kickbacks to corrections officials in exchange for overpriced contracts that exploited families. We're looking at a criminal enterprise that used the corrections system as a profit center, explained Agent Wright during his financial briefing. Families were systematically overcharged for services, with the excess revenue funding the harassment operation and enriching corrupt officials. The systematic nature of the financial exploitation added RICO charges to the growing list of federal crimes under investigation. What had started as civil rights violations had evolved into a comprehensive criminal conspiracy spanning multiple facilities and years of operations. Dr. Patricia Chen, a corrections policy expert from the State University, provided academic context for the systematic abuse. Her research had identified patterns of institutional racism in correctional facilities nationwide, but the scale of the conspiracy uncovered in this investigation was unprecedented. Institutional racism in corrections typically operates through policy implementation rather than explicit discrimination, Dr. Chen explained. But what we see here is explicit racism systematized and financially incentivized. This represents institutional racism in its most toxic form. Her analysis provided the theoretical framework that would help prosecutors demonstrate that the abuse wasn't random bias, but calculated policy designed to exploit vulnerable populations. Meanwhile, families continued coming forward with testimonies that revealed the human cost of systematic abuse. Children who had stopped visiting parents, grandparents who had given up trying to see grandchildren, spouses who had chosen divorce rather than endure ongoing humiliation. My daughter was 8 when they first strip-searched me, testified Maria Rodriguez, whose husband had been incarcerated for a nonviolent drug offense. She had nightmares for months. She stopped asking about Daddy because she associated prison visits with trauma. Their abuse didn't just target me. It destroyed my child's relationship with her father. The testimony revealed how systematic racism operated across generations, using family trauma as a tool of institutional control. The abuse wasn't just about maintaining order. It was about breaking family connections that supported rehabilitation and reintegration. Prison Board Chairman Arthur Navarro faced intense questioning about his oversight responsibilities during the legislative hearing. His previous claims of ignorance became increasingly difficult to maintain as evidence mounted of systematic complaints that had reached his office. Chairman Navarro, Senator Williams pressed, "We have documentation of 47 formal complaints filed with your office regarding visitor abuse at Riverside alone. What action did you take on these complaints?" Navarro's fumbling responses revealed the willful blindness that had enabled systematic abuse to continue. His board had the authority to investigate complaints, but had chosen to trust facility administrators rather than protect vulnerable families. "We relied on facility management to address concerns internally," Navarro explained weakly. "We assumed that professional corrections officials would handle these matters appropriately." His assumption of good faith from officials who were systematically violating civil rights highlighted the failures of oversight systems that prioritized institutional protection over individual rights. As evidence continued to accumulate, federal prosecutors prepared what would become one of the most comprehensive civil rights cases in state history. The charges would include violations of constitutional rights, financial fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering, a combination that could result in life sentences for the most culpable officials. But beyond the legal consequences, the investigation had already achieved something equally important: validation for hundreds of families who had been told their experiences didn't matter. Their complaints weren't credible. Their dignity wasn't worth protecting. The systematic pattern was finally exposed. And with that exposure came the possibility of systematic change. The Department of Justice headquarters in Washington, D.C., had been monitoring the Riverside correctional investigation since the story broke. But by the third day of expanding revelations, federal involvement escalated from observation to direct intervention. Assistant Attorney General Patricia Davis announced that the Civil Rights Division would be launching a comprehensive investigation into systematic civil rights violations in state correctional facilities. What began as an isolated incident has revealed a pattern of constitutional violations that demands federal intervention, Davis announced during a press briefing that was broadcast live across national networks. The Civil Rights Division will examine not only the specific incidents at Riverside, but the systematic policies and practices that enabled such abuse to flourish. The federal intervention carried implications that extended far beyond criminal prosecution of individual officials. Federal oversight could result in consent decrees that would fundamentally restructure how state correctional facilities operated, with court-appointed monitors ensuring compliance with constitutional standards. Agent Gonzalez received notification that additional federal resources would be assigned to the investigation, including forensic accountants, civil rights attorneys, and data analysts capable of examining patterns across the entire state corrections system. The case had grown from a local incident to a federal priority. This investigation will examine every state correctional facility, every vendor contract, and every oversight mechanism. Agent Gonzalez explained to Jade during a briefing at the federal building. "We're looking at potential violations of the Civil Rights Act, the 8th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and federal racketeering statutes." The scope of potential charges reflected the systematic nature of the violations. What had started as harassment of individual families had evolved into a comprehensive assault on constitutional protections that could result in federal takeover of the state corrections system. At Riverside Correctional, the investigation had expanded to include examination of medical records, psychological evaluations, and educational programs. Federal investigators were documenting how systematic harassment of families affected not only visitors but also the incarcerated individuals who lost contact with their support systems. Dr. Jennifer Hayes, the facility's medical director, provided data that showed disturbing correlations between family harassment and inmate mental health outcomes. We've documented increased rates of depression, self-harm, and disciplinary problems among inmates whose families were targeted for harassment, she explained to federal investigators. The medical evidence provided additional grounds for federal prosecution under statutes prohibiting cruel and unusual punishment by systematically destroying family connections that supported mental health and rehabilitation. Officials had violated constitutional protections against psychological torture. Meanwhile, the financial investigation had uncovered evidence of systematic bid rigging on state contracts that totaled nearly $50 million over 5 years. Commissary supplies, medical services, transportation, and maintenance contracts had all been awarded based on kickbacks rather than competitive bidding. The financial corruption wasn't separate from the civil rights violations, explained Agent Wright during his analysis presentation. The revenue generated by overcharging families was used to fund the harassment operation, while the kickbacks from inflated contracts provided personal enrichment for participating officials. The integration of financial and civil rights violations strengthened the federal case by demonstrating that systematic racism had been profitable, creating economic incentives for constitutional violations that would persist unless addressed through comprehensive prosecution. Federal prosecutors were preparing charges under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, which carried potential life sentences for officials who had operated criminal enterprises under color of law. The RICO charges would allow prosecution of the entire network of corruption, rather than individual incidents. We're not just prosecuting abuse of authority, explained Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Chin during a strategy meeting. We're prosecuting organized crime that used government positions to systematically exploit vulnerable populations while violating their constitutional rights. The framework of organized crime prosecution would enable comprehensive dismantling of the corruption network, while sending a message to other officials who might be tempted to abuse their authority for personal or institutional gain. Legislative oversight hearings had expanded to include federal representatives who were questioning why state oversight had failed so completely. Congressman Robert Martinez, chair of the House Subcommittee on Civil Rights, announced plans for comprehensive hearings examining federal funding of state correction systems. We provide significant federal funding to state correctional facilities with the expectation that constitutional rights will be protected, Congressman Martinez explained. When systematic abuse occurs, federal funding becomes complicity in constitutional violations. The threat to federal funding created additional pressure for comprehensive reform. State correction systems that depended on federal grants for operations would face financial crisis if funding were withdrawn due to civil rights violations. Governor Williams faced increasing pressure to demonstrate that state oversight systems would be reformed to prevent future systematic abuse. His appointment of an independent monitor to oversee corrections operations was a first step, but federal officials made clear that more comprehensive changes would be required. State oversight failed completely, Agent Gonzalez noted during a meeting with state officials. Systematic abuse continued for years despite numerous complaints because oversight systems prioritized institutional protection over individual rights. That has to change fundamentally. The federal intervention represented more than prosecution of past crimes. It was restructuring of institutional relationships to ensure that constitutional protections would be enforced rather than ignored. As the investigation entered its second week, the scope had expanded to include examination of corrections practices in neighboring states. Similar patterns of systematic abuse were emerging, suggesting that the corruption uncovered at Riverside was part of a broader national problem requiring federal attention. The case that had started with one woman's encounter with systematic racism was becoming a catalyst for nationwide examination of institutional practices that had operated in shadows for too long. The Riverside Community Center had been transformed into a coordination hub for families affected by systematic abuse at correctional facilities across the state. Tables lined the main room, staffed by civil rights attorneys, social workers, and victim advocates who were documenting testimonies and preparing legal cases for what was becoming the largest civil rights class action lawsuit in state history. Sophia Moreno coordinated the Victim Assistance Program with the efficiency of someone who had spent years preparing for exactly this moment. Her organization had maintained files on corrections abuse for over a decade, and now those files were becoming evidence in federal prosecution. We're seeing families come forward who haven't spoken about their experiences in years, Sophia explained to reporters covering the community response. Some of these testimonies go back 15 years, showing that this systematic abuse has been operating much longer than anyone realized. The testimonies revealed patterns of trauma that extended across generations. Children who had stopped visiting incarcerated parents, grandparents who had been too ashamed to describe their humiliation, spouses who had chosen divorce rather than endure ongoing harassment. All were now finding their voices in an environment that finally validated their experiences. Mrs. Santos had become an unofficial spokesperson for affected families, her dignity and articulate anger providing a powerful voice for systematic victims. Her granddaughter, no longer afraid of authority figures, had begun attending the community meetings as a symbol of resilience and hope for change. My granddaughter asks me why bad people were allowed to hurt families for so long, Mrs. Santos explained to a gathering of over 200 community members. I tell her that sometimes good people have to be very brave before bad people are stopped. Today we are being brave together. Her words resonated with families who had felt isolated in their experiences of systematic abuse. The community response provided not only practical support for legal proceedings, but also emotional healing through shared testimony and mutual support. Local churches had opened their doors to provide meeting space for affected families. Recognizing that the systematic abuse represented moral as well as legal violations that required community response. Pastor James Williams of Mount Olive Baptist Church had organized nightly prayer services for healing and justice. This abuse happened to our families because powerful people believed we didn't matter, Pastor Williams said during one such service. But God sees all things. And today God is using our Attorney General to bring justice where justice has been denied. The religious framing of the struggle provided spiritual support for families who had experienced systematic dehumanization. Churches became spaces where dignity was affirmed and community solidarity strengthened. The economic impact of the systematic abuse was becoming clear as families calculated the financial cost of inflated commissary prices, excessive phone charges, and illegal processing fees. Economic analysis suggested that affected families had been overcharged nearly $3 million over 5 years. They didn't just humiliate us, explained Robert Chin, whose son had been incarcerated for 2 years. They robbed us. We paid twice the normal rate for everything because we had no choice. Our son needed commissary money, phone contact, and visits. They used our love against us to steal our money. The economic exploitation added class action lawsuit potential to the criminal prosecution, creating opportunities for financial restitution that could help affected families recover from years of systematic overcharging. Youth organizations had mobilized to address the generational trauma caused by systematic harassment of families. Social workers documented how children had been affected by witnessing their parents' humiliation during prison visits. We're seeing kids with PTSD symptoms from watching their mothers get strip searched, explained Dr. Maria Gonzalez, a child psychologist working with affected families. Children as young as 5 have been traumatized by systematic abuse they witnessed during family visits. The documentation of childhood trauma provided additional evidence for federal prosecution, while highlighting the need for therapeutic services to address the psychological damage caused by systematic institutional abuse. College students from the nearby university had organized support services for affected families, providing child care during legal meetings, transportation to court proceedings, and advocacy training for family members who wanted to speak publicly about their experiences. This isn't just about justice for past wrongs, explained student organizer Jennifer Martinez. This is about building a movement that ensures systematic abuse never happens again. These families are teaching us how to fight institutional racism. The involvement of young people provided energy and technological support for organizing efforts, while ensuring that lessons learned from the systematic abuse would be transmitted to future generations. Media coverage of the community response had shifted from sensational reporting about individual misconduct to comprehensive examination of how systematic institutional abuse affected entire communities. Documentary filmmakers, investigative journalists, and academic researchers were all documenting the case as an example of institutional racism and community resistance. What makes this case unique is not the abuse itself, but the community response, explained Dr. Patricia Williams, a sociologist studying the case. We're seeing affected families transform from isolated victims into organized advocates for systematic change. The transformation from victimization to advocacy provided hope that the systematic abuse would result in meaningful reform rather than merely individual prosecution. As the community response grew stronger, affected families began organizing beyond their immediate needs to address broader issues of corrections reform, family support services, and institutional accountability. The systematic abuse had created a community of advocates who understood both the problem and potential solutions. We're not just fighting for ourselves anymore, Mrs. Santos explained to a legislative hearing attended by dozens of affected families. We're fighting for every family that comes after us to make sure they never have to endure what we endure. The shift from personal justice to institutional change reflected the community's recognition that systematic problems required systematic solutions, and that their organized voice could create the pressure necessary to achieve comprehensive reform. Their courage in speaking truth to power was already changing the system that had silenced them for so long. For decades, the federal courthouse in downtown has been home to some significant cases, but nothing will be as large in scope or scale as the cases against Ellis Barrow and his band of co-conspirators. The most extensive civil rights prosecution in the history of the state was announced by Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Chen. Today, a federal grand jury has returned a 47-count indictment against 11 defendants in connection with a systematic conspiracy to violate the civil rights of families visiting incarcerated individuals. Chen announced, his voice carrying the weight of institutional authority, finally aligned with constitutional justice. The indictment itself was a document of historical significance, detailing years of coordinated criminal activity conducted under color of law. Ellis Barrow faced 23 federal charges, including conspiracy to violate civil rights, deprivation of rights under color of law, financial fraud, and racketeering. The lead defendant, former Warden Ellis Barrow, is charged with operating a criminal enterprise that systematically targeted minority families for harassment, illegal searches, and financial exploitation. Chen continued, reading from prepared remarks that had been carefully crafted to convey both legal precision and moral outrage. Deputy Warden Kai Patel, below, face 18 charges for orchestrating and concealing a systemic pattern of abuse. His cooperation with federal investigators would lessen the sentences he could face for these charges. However, prosecutors made clear that systematic civil rights violations came with serious consequences. The indictment of Prison Board Chairman Arthur Navarro on obstruction of justice and conspiracy charges sent shockwaves through state government. His deliberate blindness to repeated complaints allowed years of abuse to continue, and federal prosecutors argued that deliberate ignorance was criminal complicity. Chairman Navarro received documented evidence of systematic abuse spanning 5 years, prosecutor Sarah Williams explained during the press conference. His decision to ignore these complaints while continuing to receive financial benefits from the corrupted system constitutes criminal conspiracy. The financial charges were as significant as the civil rights violations. Forensic accounting had revealed that systematic overcharging of families, inflated vendor contracts, and kickback schemes had generated over $8 million in illegal revenue over 7 years. This wasn't just abuse of authority. Chen emphasized, this was organized crime that used government positions to systematically exploit vulnerable populations while generating substantial illegal profits for participating officials. RICO charges would mean the prosecutors would be able to seize assets that had been bought with laundered funds like Barrow's vacation house, and luxury cars and investment accounts used with the steady ripping off of families. At Riverside Correctional, under federal supervision until full investigation, all was different than before. According to the new policies, any visitor processing procedure needs the approval of the federal government, and all interactions between staff and families are monitored by independent monitors. Officer Henderson, who cooperated with federal investigators at the outset of their probe, was punished administratively and not criminally due to her testimony and evidence of her attempts to stop Barrow's unlawful orders. Her experience demonstrated the ethical complexity corruption creates for individual employees within an institution. I knew what was happening was wrong, but I felt trapped between my conscience and my need for employment, Henderson explained during her administrative hearing. I documented violations because I hoped someday someone with authority would listen. Through the economic intimidation of the employees who could potentially refuse illegitimate orders, her testimony showed how a systemic manner of corruption survived. The federal investigation revealed the initial staff was speaking out against violations, but was threatened with firing or sent to a bad post. The federal prosecutor wanted witness cooperation with Liam Brooks, the guard, but he got internal discipline for his part in the original scheme of harassment. His case evidenced the difficult accountability questions that arise when corrupt institutions normalize illegal behavior. Officer Brooks's recordings were essential for proving systematic intent, Prosecutor Williams acknowledged. However, cooperation after participation doesn't eliminate responsibility for constitutional violations. Justice requires both accountability and recognition of courage in coming forward. The prosecution of vendor firms engaged in a kickback scheme, along with government officials, has broadened the scope of the case to include private contractors that profited through systematic exploitation. Federal charges have been brought against suppliers of food, cell phones, and transportation in connection with the criminal conspiracy. Private companies that profit from corruption bear equal responsibility for constitutional violations, Chen explained. The systematic exploitation of families required both government abuse and private sector complicity. In the meantime, civil rights lawyers prepared class action lawsuits for more than 400 families abused at 7 state correctional facilities. The amount of damage claimed were more than $50 million, which were losses from overcharging and fines for violating Constitution. These families were robbed of their money and their dignity, explained civil rights attorney David Martinez, who was coordinating the class action litigation. The systematic nature of this abuse requires comprehensive financial accountability, in addition to criminal prosecution. Families in civil litigation can seek pecuniary awards regardless of what happens in federal criminal prosecution and what choice is made by the feds. The pathways were structured around the different types of cases, civil and criminal. State lawmakers came under greater scrutiny to clarify how their supervision went wrong so completely, so that the systemic abuse went on for years. Institutions that had been corrupted will have emergency sessions to check on the oversight mechanism and make reforms. The legislative oversight that should have protected these families failed completely, acknowledged Senator Patricia Williams during emergency hearings. We must examine how our systems enabled systematic abuse and implement changes that ensure constitutional protections are enforced rather than ignored. As part of the legislation proposed above, states are to provide independent oversight of prison facilities, a proper process to report visitor complaints, and regular federal audits of state corrections practices. The reforms showed that systematic problems need systematic solutions. Federal sentencing guidelines suggested Barrow could face life behind bars if found guilty on all charges. The seriousness of possible sentences reflected both the systematic nature of the offenses and the federal government's policy of treating civil rights violations as among the most serious crimes. When government officials systematically violate constitutional rights for personal gain, they attack the foundation of democratic society. Chen concluded during the press conference, federal sentencing will reflect the gravity of crimes that undermine the rule of law itself. The federal prosecutor's office had become a war room preparing for what legal experts are already describing as the biggest civil rights trial of the decade. The walls were lined with evidence boxes that resembled the building blocks of justice. They contained testimony, financial records, and documentation that would make the case of systematic institutional racism. A dozen prosecutors, 6 FBI agents, and untold numbers of support staff have been working with Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Chen to gather evidence of more than 7 years' worth of abuse. The federal government's preparation reflected the complicated nature of this case and its commitment to a full prosecution. We're not just prosecuting individual incidents, Chen explained during a strategy meeting with his prosecution team. We're prosecuting a systematic conspiracy that operated as organized crime under color of law. Every piece of evidence must demonstrate the coordinated nature of this criminal enterprise. Prosecutors faced an uphill task in simplifying the overwhelming evidence in a way jurors could see the wood for the trees, while focusing on the human impact of systematic abuse. Data and charts, timelines and trends, analysis of money, would need to be balanced with personal stories that showed real effects of institutional corruption. Attorney General Jade Monroe had decided to testify as a witness in the federal prosecution, which was not the ordinary case, as the chief law enforcement officer of the state was testifying as a victim in the federal court. What she said would add factual and symbolic weight to the case. "Ma'am," Chen said during preparation sessions with Jade, "your testimony will be crucial for establishing the systematic nature of the harassment. You experienced firsthand what hundreds of other families endured, but your legal training allows you to identify the constitutional violations that other victims might not articulate." Jade's preparation involved reviewing video footage of her encounter with Barrow, listening to audio recordings of his racist comments, and studying financial documents that showed how harassment was systematically implemented. The review process was both professionally necessary and personally difficult. "Watching that footage reminds me of how calculated his abuse was," Jade reflected during preparation sessions. "This wasn't heat-of-the-moment bias. This was systematic implementation of racist policies, designed to humiliate and intimidate families." Mrs. Santos would serve as the lead victim witness, representing the hundreds of families who had endured systematic abuse without the privilege of Jade's position. Her testimony would provide emotional weight while demonstrating the broader impact of institutional corruption. Mrs. Santos represents the courage of ordinary families who refuse to be silenced, explained victim advocate Sofia Moreno during witness preparation. Her willingness to testify publicly about years of humiliation will show juries the true cost of systematic abuse. Preparation involved helping Mrs. Santos understand legal procedures while ensuring her testimony remained authentic and powerful. Her granddaughter would also appear as a witness, representing the generational impact of institutional trauma. Guard Liam Brooks faced extensive preparation for what would be the most crucial testimony in the prosecution. His audio recordings provided direct evidence of systematic intent, but his credibility as a witness required careful examination of his own participation in illegal activities. "Brooks's testimony will make or break our case for systematic conspiracy," prosecutor Sarah Williams noted during preparation sessions. "His recordings prove intent, but defense attorneys will argue that his cooperation is motivated by self-interest rather than justice." Preparing for the case involved looking through Brooks's tapes, examining the reasoning behind the decisions made, as well as the coordination of immunity agreements that prevented him from prosecution in return for the truth. Defense attorneys were working on tactics to challenge both the evidence and the quality of individual actions as a systematic conspiracy. Sterling, Barrow's criminal attorney, contended that harassment was a manifestation of bad judgment rather than a coordinated criminal enterprise. The government is trying to criminalize administrative decisions that may have been inappropriate, but don't constitute organized crime, Sterling argued during pre-trial motions. Poor treatment of visitors doesn't automatically become civil rights conspiracy. The defense strategy was to depict Barrow as an old-fashioned corrections guy whose methodology was out of date, not criminal. They would argue that systematic racism needs showed more unity than the evidence established. Federal prosecutors, in response, highlighted the financial structure that incentivized harassment, the ongoing targeting of families of color, and the deliberate concealment of complaints. The mix of financial and civil rights transgressions solidified their case for criminal conspiracy, systematic discrimination that generates illegal profits while violating constitutional rights represents organized crime regardless of the defendant's claimed motivations. Chen argued during pretrial hearings, intent is demonstrated through actions and outcomes, not stated beliefs. Meanwhile, civil rights attorneys were coordinating their class action preparation with federal prosecution to ensure that evidence would support both criminal convictions and civil damages. The parallel proceedings created opportunities for comprehensive accountability. Criminal prosecution addresses society's interest in punishment and deterrence, explained civil rights attorney David Martinez. Civil litigation addresses victims' interests in financial restitution and institutional reform. Both are necessary for complete justice. Jury selection would be crucial for ensuring fair consideration of evidence that involves systematic racism and institutional corruption. Federal prosecutors worked with jury consultants to identify potential biases that might affect deliberation on civil rights violations. We need jurors who can evaluate systematic evidence objectively, while understanding the human impact of institutional abuse, Prosecutor Williams explained. This case requires both analytical thinking and moral courage. The trial is set to begin in 6 weeks' time and last 3 months. Owing to the complexity of the evidence and the number of witnesses, federal courts had devoted significant resources to allowing full hearings to create precedent for the prosecution of systemic institutional corruption. Coverage in the media was already turning to bigger issues, like enforcing civil rights, reforming corrections, and holding institutional racists accountable. The trial would likely attract significant attention from legal experts, civil rights groups, and communities affected by systemic abuse across the nation. As preparations progressed, the group mobilized support for witnesses who would testify about systematic humiliation that lasted for years. Whether such systemic institutional racism faced real legal accountability depended on whether they showed the courage. The stage is set for a trial that shall answer the question not merely of guilt of individuals, but also of the federal government's commitment to ensuring constitutional protections for society's most vulnerable. 3 months after the trial began, the federal courthouse buzzed with anticipation as hundreds of affected families, media representatives, and civil rights advocates gathered for the verdict in what had become known as the Riverside Civil Rights Case. The jury had deliberated for 4 days, reviewing thousands of pages of evidence and hours of testimony that had laid bare the systematic nature of institutional racism. Judge Patricia Morrison called the courtroom to order as Ellis Barrow sat at the defense table, his once imposing presence diminished by months of testimony that had revealed the calculated cruelty of his systematic abuse. His face showed the resignation of a man who had finally understood that his decades of unchecked authority were ending. Attorney General Jade Monroe sat in the front row with Mrs. Santos and her granddaughter, representing both the institutional authority that had demanded justice and the ordinary families who had suffered while waiting for it. Their presence together symbolized the coalition that had brought systematic abuse into the light. As the jury reached a verdict, Judge Morrison asked, "We have, Your Honor," replied the jury foreman, a retired teacher whose expression carried the gravity of someone who had spent weeks examining evidence of institutional corruption. "On the charge of conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of law, how do you find guilty?" The word echoed through the courtroom like a thunderclap. Mrs. Santos reached for her granddaughter's hand as tears of relief and vindication began flowing down her cheeks. Years of humiliation, of being told their experiences didn't matter, of watching their complaints disappear into bureaucratic silence. All of it was finally being acknowledged and condemned. On the charge of operating a criminal enterprise under RICO statutes, how do you find guilty? The verdict on all 23 charges was delivered one by one. Conspiracy, fraud money, breach of civil rights. Each guilty verdict confirmed that the families who were dehumanized and exploited were human. The jury clearly understood that there was not mere misconduct, but a scheme going on which was under color of law. When the final count was read, Barrow was statue-like, staring at the table as if this was happening to someone else. The 23 convictions carried the possibility of a life sentence of imprisonment in the federal penitentiary for the perpetrator who systematically stole away the liberty and dignity of hundreds of families. Kai Patel, the deputy warden, got guilty verdicts on 18 counts. His cooperation reduced some JJ, but did not absolve him of responsibility for systematic abuse. The conviction of prison board chairman Arthur Navarro on obstruction and conspiracy charges sent a clear message regarding the criminal consequences of willful blindness to constitutional violations. Judge Morrison set sentencing for 6 weeks later, but her comments at verdict acceptance made it clear of the punishment that awaited the convicted officials. The evidence in this case reveals systematic violations of constitutional rights that strike at the heart of our democratic society, Judge Morrison stated. When government officials abuse their authority to target citizens based on race, while enriching themselves through corruption, they undermine the rule of law itself. Outside the courthouse, hundreds of families who had endured systematic abuse gathered in celebration and solidarity. Mrs. Santos spoke to assembled media with her granddaughter beside her, no longer the frightened child who had once clung to her grandmother's hand during prison visits. Today, justice said that our dignity matters, our families matter, and our children matter. Mrs. Santos declared, her voice carrying across the courthouse steps. No one will ever again tell us that our suffering was acceptable or that our complaints don't deserve attention. The state correction system, transformed in every facility, policy and procedure, impacting how families interacted with incarcerated loved ones. 6 months after the verdicts, the broad reforms that prosecutors mandated as part of federal oversight should go beyond punishment of individual criminals. Rather, efforts should center on changing the institutional culture of police, the courts, corrections, and other actors in the criminal justice system. Riverside Correctional was now the Santos Family Justice Center, named in honor of the grandmother whose bravery helped disclose systemic abuse. The facility was now overseen by the federal government under a consent decree with independence that ensured its constitutional compliance. It used to take hours through harassment when processing visitors, but now it does it respectfully. The difference is like night and day, explained Maria Rodriguez, whose daughter could now visit her incarcerated husband without fear or humiliation. My child asks when we can visit Daddy instead of begging me not to take her. That change is worth everything we endured. Ellis Barrow had been sentenced to life in federal prison, without possibility of parole, a sentence that Judge Morrison described as necessary to deter other officials who might consider systematic abuse of constitutional rights. His appeal was pending, but legal experts considered reversal unlikely, given the overwhelming evidence of systematic criminal conspiracy. Barrow's sentence sends a clear message that systematic racism will face the harshest penalties available under federal law, explained civil rights attorney David Martinez. No one is above the law, and no position of authority provides immunity for constitutional violations. The class action lawsuit for civil rights caused the state to settle for $60 million from seized assets, insurance proceeds, and state appropriation. Families affected by butterfly-on-butterfly abuse passed away. The purpose of funding was to secure mental health counseling services to deal with trauma. Attorney General Jade Monroe presented before the state legislature's enactment of new oversight laws. Regular federal audits, along with mandated complaint investigations and independent monitoring, would put institutional racism out of business and ensure accountability. What happened at Riverside and other facilities was enabled by systems that prioritized institutional protection over individual rights. Jade explained to assembled legislators. These reforms ensure that complaints will be investigated, violations will be prosecuted, and families will be protected. Mrs. Santos was appointed to the new State Corrections Oversight Board, where she gained insight from being a victim of systematic abuse to develop policies. The presence of her 12-year-old granddaughter at board meetings reminded her of the impact of institutions on the next generation. Officer Liam Brooks was now a federal witness coordinator who helped other corrections employees report institutional abuse without retaliation. His shift from apathetically participating to an agent of reform was symbolism or redemption in corrupted systems. The reforms not only dealt with corrections, but now looked at systematic racism in other state institutions. Other investigations were also underway in child protection and welfare services, health services, and educational systems, where power imbalances created opportunities for violations of rights guaranteed by the Constitution. Riverside was a catalyst, explained Dr. Patricia Williams, the sociologist who had studied the case. Once systematic racism was exposed and prosecuted in corrections, similar patterns became visible in other institutions. The accountability established here created pressure for comprehensive examination of institutional practices. Due to significant media attention, the case became a blueprint for civil rights enforcement. DOJ officials pointed to the case as proof that federal intervention could break down systematic institutional racism when local oversight failed. Jade walked through the newly recreated Santos Family Justice Center and thought about what it takes to make systemic change. Her hour of embarrassment had become a years-long campaign of improvement that will prevent thousands of families from suffering the same abuse. At times, one needs to experience injustice for justice. One story down, many more to honor. Subscribe to Chains Broken and help us keep history alive. Your support turns silence into sound. If this story reminded you that courage refuses to be silenced, hit subscribe. Together we ensure their bravery is never erased from history. Every subscriber here isn't just a number. You're a witness to stories that fought to be told. The little girl who had once been afraid of police uniforms now proudly wore a badge identifying her as a junior member of the Oversight Board. Her presence in meetings where policy was made served as a constant reminder that institutional decisions affected real people, real families, and real futures. The chains of systematic racism had been broken, replaced by systems of accountability that would ensure constitutional protections were enforced rather than ignored. The courage of ordinary families who refused to accept abuse had created extraordinary change that would protect generations yet to come.